Hello, everyone. I am Ben Johnson, and this is the Perpetual Chess Podcast. Perpetual Chess is a weekly chess interview show where we talk with accomplished chess players, authors, and personalities about their lives, their careers, and how to improve at chess. Perpetual Chess is brought to you through the generosity of its Patreon and PayPal supporters and by Chessable.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess. We have quite a distinguished guest joining us this week. He is an author, a leading Bobby Fischer historian, the author of Bobby Fischer, Profile of a Prodigy, and Endgame, The Spectacular Rise and Fall of Bobby Fischer, which is an award-winning book and was the first book about a chess player on the New York Times bestseller list. He was the founding editor of Chess Life magazine, former president of the Marshall Chess Club, a professor and the retired chairman of the Department of Mass Communications, Journalism, Television, and Film at St. John's University. And he is now joining us on the show, 86 years of age and still looking and sounding sharp in our little chat before we brought him in. So now let's welcome him to the show, Dr. Frank Brady. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the talk.
Excellent. Yeah, I am super excited. And there's so many directions we could go. I mean, you had such a distinguished career both in and outside of chess. But of course, this is a chess podcast, so you can guess that will be our primary focus. So, Frank, if you don't mind, though, the first thing I wanted to hear about from all of your experiences and your writings was the fact that, as you have written and said, you were you believe to be the first chess player, chess fan, or / journalist to arrive in Reykjavik in 1972 for the famous match of the century between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky, and the last to leave. And you attended every game in that absolutely historic match. So all these years later, I know you've written about it. I'm sure you've spoken about it. But what's the first thing you think of, Frank, when you think back on that experience?
Well, it was one of the greatest chess experiences in my life in that I witnessed, in effect, the first American to become world champion. It was an incredible moment, and I couldn't get enough of it. By the way, not only did I attend every game, I attended every adjournment, every press conference, and everything else that surrounded the tournament, the match. Bobby was a spectacular figure and a controversial figure and a bit of a friend, I would say, of mine. I followed his life ever since he was a kid. And now he was 29 years old and he finally made it to the top. And I was just so happy to be there. And it was quite the place was incredible. There were hundreds of journalists and reporters, and it was like being in Lisbon during the World War II. People with rumors and conferences and interviews. It was an exciting place to be.
It's amazing. I mean, we've had so many guests come on the show and talk about how that match touched their lives, altered the trajectory of their lives because of the chess boom that followed, which I think we'll discuss in due time. But first, let's just get a little more on the ground details. So first of all, Frank, under what auspices were you there? Was it just because you had a friendly relationship with Bobby and were a friend, or was it in like a reporter's capacity?
Not at all. I went as a correspondent for PBS, working with Shelby Lyman, who was on the air in Channel 13 in New York City. Shelby knew I was going to go to Iceland because I was reworking a new biography of Bobby Fischer, bringing the book up to the end of the World Championship. And so he brought me up to PBS and introduced me there. And they made a deal with me to go to Iceland. And they gave me a car when I got there for my use and paid me a ridiculously small amount of money, I might say. And I worked for PBS, calling Shelby after every single game and every adjournment. And sometimes I'd get on the air. Sometimes it would just be color, background that I gave him on what was going on at the match and the controversies that appeared. Also, a number of other places. ABC TV Wide World of Sports hired me to do one session, which was interesting. And Harold Schonberg, who was the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times, was working on front-page stories on the match. And in his very first story, he made a mistake. It's just a minor mistake, but he made a mistake and it got published. And nobody pointed it out. And I said, Harold, you made a mistake there. And he said, what do you mean? And I pointed it out. And he said, my God, you're right. You're absolutely right. He said, I'll tell you what, will you please read every one of my copies before it goes to the Times? But you cannot tell the New York Times that you're doing it, and you cannot tell my wife when she shows up. I don't want anybody to know. And he paid me a very small amount of money to do it again. So it was, I was working on a number of fronts. I was also there was this radio station in San Francisco, and I was giving commentary to them. So, and on top of all of it, I was writing my new book on Bobby Fischer, my new biography of Bobby Fischer.
Which was that Profile of a Prodigy?
No, that had already come out.
Okay.
And this brought his life up to the point of winning the World Championship. The new book brought his life up to the point of winning the World Championship. And of course, I would have had to write that he lost it if he lost it. But I was right on the scene. I was writing every day, writing every night, and also doing some of these broadcast things.
And of course, this match is famed for all of its twists and turns and the world watching. So what was life like on the ground? Was everyone talking about it everywhere you went? And what was like, were you in a reporter's room? I'd just like to get as many details as possible about.
Yeah, I was I had press credentials, and I was in a reporter's room. Of course, I could stroll out of that and walk into the auditorium of Lagerstahl Hall, and which I did. I went to the press conferences that were given. Bobby gave no press conferences on his own that I can remember, but his team, he had a few people working for him. Fred Cramer, who was then the president of the United States Chess Federation, was there, and a few others. My friend Don Schultz, who eventually died recently of the COVID, was there as well. And Dr. Euwe, the president of FIDE, was giving conferences, and the president of the Icelandic Chess Federation. So there were conferences all the time. When you walked into the Hotel Loft Leader, where Bobby was staying, I mean, the lobby was filled with people talking about what's going to happen next. Is Bobby going to drop out? Is Bobby going to stay in? What's going on? The Russians cheating? Is Bobby cheating? I mean, it was fun. I mean, I used to just get up in the morning and get into my little Volkswagen, which I could hardly fit into, and drive there and park myself into the lobby of the Hotel Loft Leader, interview people and talk to people and talk to the other journalists who were there and get information.
And you've written in Endgame, I'd just like to share the following quote. You say, I've been following Bobby Fischer's life story from the first time we met at a chess tournament when he was a child and I was a teen, all the way to his grave in the remote and windswept countryside of Iceland. Over the years, we played hundreds of games together, dined in Greenwich Village restaurants, traveled to tournaments, attended dinner parties, and walked the streets of Manhattan for hours on end. He was light years ahead of me in chess ability, but despite the yawning gap that separated us, we found ways to bond. And I know that in later years, as you write about, the bond may not have been as strong, unfortunately. But what was the state of your relationship with Bobby at that point? When
during the match, there was no relationship. We didn't talk during the entire time. I didn't try to interview him. He was, angry with me at writing the very first book because I mentioned in the first book that he was Jewish. And he didn't want me to do that. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry I did it. I'm sorry that he was angry about it, but I felt it was a biography, and I thought it was important to put it in. And so I didn't really talk to him. He didn't give interviews to anybody, actually. And He had a few friends. Jack Collins, of course, he was there. Lombardy, Larry Evans, and others that came. Evans was there just for about a week, but Collins was there for the whole time. Lombardy was there for the whole time, and they had a suite. And Collins, had like almost a little chess salon in his suite. People would go there and analyze the game afterwards and stuff. And Bobby would be there playing games. But no, there was no relationship with Bobby during the match at all with me.
Okay. And since you mentioned the fact that you'd written that he was Jewish, I mean, there's a lot of topics I wanted to discuss, but one of them I was corresponding with my friend FM Donny Ariel, and he and other like chess historians and extreme chess fans have submitted some questions that I'll be getting to in the course of the interview. But Donny was wondering, so of course there's the question of Fischer's father, which I know you've written about at length, but I'd still, if you don't mind, like to hear you discuss that a little bit. And in a related matter, sort of how he reconciled the fact that he was Jewish with obviously the anti-Semitic views that he became increasingly known for, unfortunately, later in his life.
Well, it's a very complicated question. I try to tackle it in the book. And in my life and in my relationship to Bobby, Bobby's father, I had always thought that Bobby's father was Gerhardt Fischer, who was Jewish and who split with Mrs. Fischer. They divorced, and that and she was having an affair with another man back in 1942. And a lot of people, Paul Nemenyi, and a lot of people think that Paul Nemenyi, a Hungarian physicist, was the father. And that how could Gerhard Fischer really be the father since he never came to the United States? But Mrs. Fischer, and this could be found in her passport actually, did go to Mexico X number of months, 9 or 10 months before Bobby was born, to meet Gerhardt, probably to get money from him because he was not supporting Bobby. And she claimed to a social worker, and I found this in the FBI file, that they had an assignation at that time, and that it's possible she didn't know who the real father was because she was seeing this other man at the same time. The other man did help out financially. And he was Jewish. And of course, Mrs. Fischer was Jewish, but not an observant Jew. So Bobby, felt he was mistreated by the Jewish chess community in New York City, and who favored Reshevsky over him. And he again began to start to blame the Jews for almost everything. David Mamet wrote a very interesting book about self-hating Jews. I recommend that you read it that indeed it's not only Jews, but other people as well who are, quote, in the minority. There are some that just cannot bear to be in that minority. And so they're going to find all kinds of ways to reject their own identity in that. And that's what happened to Bobby after a while. He was saying he wasn't Jewish. He was never circumcised. That is true. But his mother, in those days, a number of people weren't circumcised at that point, and it wasn't done for Jewish reasons or anything, but they didn't believe in it. So, he used that as a proof that, in effect, that he really wasn't Jewish. Yet, on the other hand, Karl Berger, a master who belonged to the Marshall Chess Club, claimed that Bobby was studying the Torah to get bar mitzvahed. There's a player, a chess collector, David Delucia, who probably has one of the most famous chess collections of memorabilia in the world, has a chess set that he claims was a bar mitzvah gift to Bobby. So Yeah, I could see that, and this is speculation on my part. I could see Mrs. Fischer, who wasn't really observant, but still wanted her son to be bar mitzvahed, had a minion at her home, and taught Bobby some Hebrew enough to become a bar mitzvah boy, and Bobby just either forgot that he did it or just repressed it. But Bobby Fischer was a Jew,
right? And since his dad wasn't around, whichever individual it was, maybe it didn't consume him that much. But do you have a sense who Bobby thought his father was?
Well, that also is complicated because he never, according to Gardar Sverrisson, who was his closest friend in Iceland before he died, took him to the hospital, arranged the burial when he did die. According to Gardar Sverrisson, he never denied that Paul Nemenyi was his father when it was brought up, but he never liked to talk about it. I mean, I brought up the question of the father a few times with him, and he just, he brushed me off. He didn't want to talk about who his father was. On the other hand, there was a rumor. I mean, there's a lot of rumors that didn't get into my book, or that I don't even like to share, but that when Bobby was going to Germany, when he was living in Hungary, and he was going to Germany with Benko, that's true, because Benko was playing in one of the German leagues there. And then when they reached Berlin, Benko would go his way and Bobby would go his. The rumor was that he was trying to search for his father because Gerhardt Fischer had moved back to Berlin from Chile, where he had been living all his life. Whether that's true, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you do at least touch on it in Endgame. I reread it recently, obviously, in anticipation of this interview. And my last question on the father thing. So, okay, he didn't like to talk about, and possibly knew, possibly didn't know whether his father was Fischer or Nemenyi. But did he know that? Did he think of Fischer, his father, as Hans Fischer, as Jewish as well? Or because obviously, if all three parents, if both prospective dads are Jewish in addition to the mother, then he's 100% aware that he's 100% Jewish.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know how that I never heard him deny that Hans Fischer was Jewish, but as I said, he didn't talk so much about who his parent was or was not, or the parental parent. So it's possible that I asked Mrs. Fischer that one time. This is before I ever even considered writing a book. But when I knew her, when he was a kid, I might have asked. That came up. She didn't like to talk about it either.
Yeah,
I don't know. He probably knew that Hans Gerhardt was a Jew, and Paul Nemenyi was definitely Jewish.
Okay.
And Mrs. Fischer, and when Mrs. Fischer got remarried, she married someone who was Jewish, who's buried in a Jewish cemetery. I mean,
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for discussing that. Why don't we talk a little more about what his personality was like? I mean, obviously, you're friendly with I Am John Donaldson, who has a new tome out about Fischer, and I'm excited. John's been on the show, just obviously an encyclopedia of chess history with, like yourself, a particular interest in and knowledge of Bobby Fischer. And he recently did an interview with GM Grandmaster Jesse Cry of Chess Dojo, where he was saying that he felt like Bobby Fischer had many personalities over the course of his life. Was that your experience as well? And when you think of your times with him, especially in his younger days, how do you characterize his personality?
Well, I think we all have many personalities. Virginia Woolf wrote one biography of the artist Christopher Fry, and she said, as a biographer, you might be able to try to capture 2 or 3 kinds of personalities that a person may have, but indeed, most people might have as many as 1,000 different personalities. Right. Bobby was, I'll tell you, he was generous, and yes, he was parsimonious. He was. He could be gentle. He could be cruel. He had so many different elements. I wouldn't call him schizophrenic. I'm not implying that, but you never knew what you were going to get each time you met Bobby. And he once I was walking down Fifth Avenue with him, going near. I think we were going to the club, the Marshall Chess Club, and but we were going to eat beforehand. And I was suggesting a particular restaurant, and he just turned and he said, "I'm going." He walked away, like without discussing it. He said, "I'm going to Holiday Inn or wherever it was." Howard Johnson's, I meant. And in other words, he just did what he wanted to do, and he could be very abrupt and rude. But I found him at his best to be a friend, and he had all the elements that a friend might have. At one point, I was broke. I didn't have much money. I was trying to launch a magazine called Chess World.
Yes, yeah.
Put out with only 3 issues of it. I was doing it on less than a shoestring, a half of a shoestring. And indeed, he asked me. He said, "You need any money? I have some money. I can lend you some money." I mean, none of my relatives said that to me.
That's interesting.
It was no, I didn't take it, but it was very, very generous and nice of him to do that. Then he would bring me gifts when he came back from international tournaments, and he'd bring me a tie or bring me a this or that or the other thing. So I found him to be a friend, but if you crossed him in the ways that my putting the fact that he was Jewish in my book, it was really the first book written about him. He didn't want to talk to me after that.
Yeah, that must have been difficult. So a couple follow-ups. So number one, you mentioned obviously it's definitely fair to characterize him as eccentric at minimum. Did you see so you first encountered him as a teen. When did you first get to know him? And was he as eccentric as in the earliest days that you knew him?
I wouldn't say it was eccentric. That I first saw Bobby. I just saw him at the U.S. Amateur Championship in Asbury Park. It was not a team championship; it was an individual championship. About 125 players, something like that. And his mother brought him. His mother was there, and Carmine Nigro, his teacher, brought him there. And I never talked to him, but I was watching. Everybody was watching him because he was so tiny. He grew up to be like 6'2", but he was so tiny at that time, and it was a novelty to have such a little kid playing. And I talked to his mother at that time. And then in a tournament on the Upper West Side, which Lombardy won, I played in it terribly. But Bobby was there, and I'm not sure I even talked to him then. When I really started talking to him was when I became the business manager of the United States Chess Federation. I was working for the United States Chess Federation full time, and Mrs. Fischer brought him up to the office, and she was trying to get him to get money so that he could play in various tournaments. And she kept coming back with him, and he was very shy. And he didn't meet my eyes, and he didn't say much, but I got to know him. But when we really got to know him was when he played in the Fischer-Spassky, Reshevsky match, rather. And it blew up. It ended in a 5.5 tie, and Fischer was forfeited for not showing up. And that's a complicated story. It would take forever to discuss. But and I wrote editorials about him in support of him in Chess Life. I had started Chess Life magazine. And the U.S. Chess Federation president and others didn't like it. and I actually lost my job over it.
Wow.
And, I was scared because I was just starting a family at that point. And all of a sudden I had no job. And in retrospect, maybe they were right. Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut. But I believe that Bobby, even though he was a kid, should have been garnered more respect. And he wasn't. They were treating him like just a kid. So from that time on, all of a sudden, Bobby started coming to my apartment, and we started hanging out together. And that's when we started to play 5-minute chess, or I would play 5 minutes and he would play 2-minute chess, and he'd still beat me, of course, every game. And we bonded at that point.
So after those years, Frank, how did your relationship evolve with Bobby? Like, I know you mentioned, a lot of long walks with him, a lot of trips to restaurants. Were those like coordinated gatherings, or would it be like you saw him at the chess club and ended up hanging out together, sort of thing?
He rarely ever called me. Sometimes I would call him. But when I was living in the village, right after that Fischer-Reshevsky match, he would come, just show up in my apartment. And he liked coming there because I don't know if he liked coming there to see me or because I had a lot of different chess magazines and books. And he'd plunk himself down in my living room, sit in my butterfly chair, which was popular in the 1960s, and open the various chess magazines that I was getting from all over the world and go through them. And some of them he would just say, "It's all right if I have them." And I'd say, "Yeah, you can take them." But, no, I haven't read that yet, Bobby. And then my wife was a second grade school teacher. She wasn't around too much during the afternoons, not at all. And then I'd say, "Bobby, where are you eating?" And he said, "I don't know. What are you doing tonight?" "I don't know. Well, let's go. Let's go and get something to eat." And we'd go off to the Mexican Gardens or one of my favorite restaurants, whatever, or a favorite restaurant of mine. And then we'd often then go to the Marshall Chess Club and start to play chess. And I don't know why he played with me. I mean, I wasn't such a bad player. I was like a Class A player, but and I wish that what I had learned from him had rubbed off, but it didn't rub off because we played, speed chess, and it was crazy. I didn't think I learned very much out of it. I think I'm much better in time trouble now than I ever was. Other than that, I can't relate what I've learned.
Well, I know that, I know you've been interviewed by Fred Wilson twice. I'm friendly with him. He's been on this podcast as well. And his archive of interviews is available for Patreon subscribers of Perpetual Chess. So
when was that? Do you remember?
So you had 2 interviews with him. I believe they were 2003 and 2006.
Oh, I see.
But you tell the story of the chess improvement advice that Fischer gave you in one of those interviews. So I'm sure my listeners would love to hear that.
Well, my brother was a great pool player, and he taught me how to play. I was never anywhere near as good as he. And I used to like to play pool, and somehow I mentioned it to Bobby, and he asked if I would teach him, and I did. An X number of lessons. Maybe I gave him 6 or 8 lessons on, all the rudiments, how to hold a cue stick, what to do, how to line up a shot, and so forth, how to get English on your ball and on your cubes. And once when I was walking home from that, I said, "Hey, Bobby, how about since I'm teaching you to play pool, how about me teaching you teaching me how to play? Give me some lessons." He said, "Okay, for the first lesson, read every column in MCO, Modern Chess Openings, and including the footnotes, every column, and not just read them." He said, "Understand them." So I said, "Oh my God." I said, "Okay, so what's the second lesson, Bobby?" He said, "Do it over again."
It's an amazing story. So, but these are basically just like reams of opening theory, right?
thousands and thousands and thousands of lines, and it shows it's a good story because that's the way Bobby was. He absorbed everything. He told Shelby Lyman that he read every single chess book in the Brooklyn Public Library. And the Brooklyn Public Library at Grand Army Plaza is one of the great libraries in New York City. It's got thousands of books. He said he read every one of them and took from them what was good. And I believe him. I mean, he always had books. And there have been other players. Reuben Fine. I remember Reuben Fine, by the way. I really go back. He was actually my psychoanalyst.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. He always had, under both of his arms, Reuben would have any chess book he could find under his arms, walking the street, coming into the marshal, whatever.
It's interesting because these days a lot of chess trainers would push back against the notion that the best way to get better at chess is to memorize tons of opening theory. But on the other hand, it sounds like what you're getting at is like in addition to whatever talent he had and whatever intelligence he had, which I also want to discuss, but it was mainly just like an insatiable appetite for chess combined with a memory more so than specifically MCO.
Yes, he wanted everything in terms of chess. I mean, he really studied the game. He would the last thing he would do at night is look at a board next to his bed, look at a position, move the pieces around, so forth. When he woke up the next morning, he continued doing that. When he took a bath, his mother would put in a board across the bathtub with the chess set on it, and he would constantly. He walked around with a little pocket set in his hands, and he played. By the way, he said that he got that from Alekin.
That idea?
Yeah, that idea of having that little pocket set. But he could play the game. His friend, he had a close chess friend by the name of Bernard Zuckerman, who was an international master. You may know the name.
Yeah, legendary New York figure.
Yeah, and when they'd walk along the street to go out to get a bite to eat or something, and they would play a game.
Yeah, just walking around
on the street. And he would do that. Also, he did it with Jack Collins, he really knew the game. He didn't need it. He really didn't need a board.
That's amazing. Okay, Frank, I have one or two more questions on Bobby personally that I'd like to ask, and then we have a few from listeners, and then, of course, I'd like to get to some other topics as well, although this is amazing to hear your firsthand experience. So another question, Frank, that gets kind of batted around the internet, I suspect someone has asked you in the past, but in your opinion, do you think that Bobby Fischer had Asperger's syndrome?
He may well have. I've asked Stuart Margulies, who was a master who knew Bobby well and was a psychologist, or is still a psychologist, a Columbia University PhD, and he said no, he didn't think Bobby had Asperger's. Ariel Mengarini, an American master, and who was a psychiatrist who examined Bobby or talked to Bobby very early on and then knew Bobby and played Bobby later on in tournaments, said he didn't think there was any, he said, the kid was neurotic, but, almost we're all neurotic in some way.
Right.
And, he wasn't really that much different. He was strange as he got older, and his ideas, his political views, and the way, he could treat people. Sometimes he was really downright, as I said, he could be cruel, and yet on the other hand, he could be friendly, truly friendly and nice to hang around with. I could tickle his funny bone. I mean, I could get him to laugh a lot. He didn't get me to laugh so much with jokes, but I could get him to laugh.
Okay, and then there's also the question, which I know you're on the record, but I do think this stuff is important to discuss. The question of Fischer's IQ. Could you tell the story of how you became sort of the primary source of Fischer's genius level IQ?
Okay, yes, a number of people have questioned that, but there was a man by the name of Milton Hanauer, who was the president of the Marshall Chess Club, twice Marshall Chess Club champion, wrote several chess books, including Chess Made Simple, I think it's called, that became well known. And Milton was the principal of a high school in the Bronx, if I'm not mistaken. And he knew someone in the grade advisor's office or the administration office of Erasmus High School where Bobby went. And apparently Erasmus gave IQ tests at that time. I took my IQ test in grammar school in the 8th grade, and they announced it. When the results came in, they would call everybody and say, in front of everybody, and tell you what IQ was. And it was really interesting. The person who got the lowest IQ in my 8th grade class turned out to be a multimillionaire, successful,
right.
on the radio. And the person who got the highest went nowhere. But nevertheless, so he asked this grade advisor, could you possibly do it? It was probably illegal for the man to do it. Nowadays, they would never do something like that. But the man looked up and he said it was 180. So that's my source.
Okay. And what were your interactions with, obviously his chess talent and abilities precede them. We don't need you to describe those, but what were his intellectual powers like generally? I mean, I know that in his younger days, you push back against the notion that he was like a savant, but did he have a curiosity about other topics as like a teen and in his 20s?
Not too much, no. The key to Bobby was this exclusivity that he had toward the game. The game, chess, was the whole thing in his life. Everything else was ignored. I mean, you could get him into a conversation sometimes about politics or science or something, but not much. He wanted to talk about chess. Maybe that's why he liked me. I like to talk about it too. But I had other interests. But indeed, I don't think that has anything to do with his IQ. He was exclusive to chess. And so it wasn't until he reached the World's Championship at the age of 29 where he then said, now I can devote myself to other things. And he began to read other things. Unfortunately, some of the other things that he read were not particularly good, anti-Semitic literature and stuff like that. But, he was interested in ideas. He wanted to talk to people. He didn't want to only talk about chess. Gardar Sverrisson told me that what the heck was it? A novelist was in Reykjavik, a man by the name of Robert Mundell, who was the father of the euro and who was the person who sort of invented or wrote about, championed supply side economics, was in Reykjavik and mentioned that he'd like to meet Bobby. And Bobby said, let's do it. And they met at a restaurant, the three of them, Gardar and Mundell and Bobby immediately started to ask Mundell questions about economics. And he could talk about it. And he knew about it because he had been reading. Again, from the time about 29 up to his death at the age of 64. And he'd read books on philosophy and history, all kinds of stuff.
And you also wrote an Endgame that at 29, after winning the World Championship, he expressed maybe more interest in finding a romantic partner. Yeah,
he said, now I'm ready to do that. Absolutely. And it took him a long time to finally. I mean, he had various assignations and various relationships, but it wasn't until what was her name, Zita Brzezinska, came along, who wrote him a letter and
changed the course of chess history. Yes. Since that led to the rematch with Spassky. So would he talk about women much when you knew him? I mean, you already mentioned he was primarily interested in chess.
Yeah, to some extent, but not anything special. I can't remember her name. There was a chess player who brought him to a brothel once.
Right, yeah, in Argentina. drawing a blank on who it was as well.
Yeah, and I just can't remember the man's name, but brought him to Prato and said that it was Bobby's first time with a woman, and he came out and supposedly Bobby said, "I wasn't as good as chess."
Yeah. Okay. So Frank, we've got some questions from friends and supporters of the podcast. So a couple of them Fischer related. So I'd like to read you those, but first we're going to take a break and hear from our sponsors, Chessable.com. If you want to find out more about the life, the legacy, and the tragedy of the life of Bobby Fischer, there is no greater authority than Dr. Frank Brady. But if you want to learn about the chess of Bobby Fischer, then Chessable.com has some great places to start, including with My Great Predecessors Part 4 by former world champion Garry Kasparov. He tells great stories about Fischer and his contemporaries, as well as going over his brilliant games. There's also a tactics training course on Bobby Fischer, a strategy training course on Bobby Fischer, and of course, all of these Chessable offerings have move trainer technology to help you remember these amazing moves and patterns that Bobby played. So in addition to all of their other courses, Chessable.com can help you learn about Fischer, so go to Chessable and check it out. And we are back, and my first Patreon supporter question for you, Frank, is from friend of the podcast, friend and supporter Chris Wainscott. Chris, a big Fischer file in his own right. And Chris says, first of all, I've read both versions of Profile of a Prodigy as well as Endgame and found that all three to be enjoyable and informative. My question concerns the Log Cabin Chess Club and its founder, E4E Locks. I'm sure I said that wrong. Can you share any stories about the club? Some chess fans may be familiar with the early Fischer connection there, though many likely are not. In the interest of those not familiar with the organization or with its founder, perhaps a Fischer story would be in order. However, for those of us who are at least relatively familiar with the Log Cabin Club, perhaps you could also share a less well-known story. And then Chris says, thank you so much for your writings and thank you for coming on this podcast, all of which help maintain the pantheon of chess history, which of course I echo Chris's thanks there.
Well, I knew Fari well. The Log Cabin Chess Club, located in, I think it was West Orange, New Jersey. I hope New Jersey will forgive me if I have the town wrong, but any event, he was very wealthy. He was a graduate of Princeton, but he didn't act like an educated man for some reason. He didn't talk like that. Really interested in chess. He was a weak player, and he ran the club in his home. It was a large home, wasn't a mansion, but just a very large home. And he was always having chess players in, and he had a beautifully decorated wood-paneled basement that looked like a log cabin, and that's how it got its name, the Log Cabin Chess Club. And because he was playing all the time and having tournaments there all the time, and also anybody who was sort of down and out and was looking for a room, he had extra bedrooms and they could stay there. He was driving his wife and his two kids crazy. So, or maybe not the two kids, but certainly the wife. And so she moved out. He had a country house in Old Lyme, Connecticut. She moved out of the house just so that chess could take it over. So he had an old station wagon, and he would drive all over the country with 6 or 7 of his players, and they would play matches all over the place. Fari himself played in just about every U.S. Open championship that I can remember. In fact, he died playing in the U.S. Open that was held at San Juan, Puerto Rico. He was a strange guy in many ways. He seemed to be had Nazi proclivities. I mean, he wore a little swastika on his lapel some of the time. Some of the time he's dressed in lederhosen and with sort of an alpine hat, and he was very, very German. But I found him to have a good heart. He was, when I was at the U.S. Chess Federation, always looking for people to donate money for teams that are going here, there, and everywhere, or for individuals, Fari always came through. I mean, not with thousands, but with hundreds, almost all the time. I'd call him up and say, Bobby needs $100 to go to this place, or the team needs as much as you can do, and he would always come through. He was a good philanthropist for chess, and there were tournaments in there, things I don't even feel like I should tell about Fari, but he was he was a strange man, and anybody who needed a bed in that house, whoever they were, he'd give it to them, and he'd pick up meals. I mean, he had a strange thing. He would say, if he took people to restaurants, he'd say, order whatever you want on the menu, but no alcohol. He would never put alcohol.
That's no fun.
So, and he kept saying he was the Log Cabin Chess Club was the first chess club ever to visit Fairbanks, Alaska. The Log Cabin Chess Club was the first to fly to Europe, whatever. And he used to love being the first to do something, And he himself, by the way, was a poor player. If there were 250 people in the tournament, he'd come in about 230, something like that. But he loved the game, and he had a great time playing it.
It's more important. Well, thank you for that. A couple other questions I want to get to. This one is Fischer related from Brian Karen. And Brian is wondering, he says, what were pre-1972 Fischer's sane political views? Like, what did he think of the Kennedys or other 1960s presidents and parties? And then there's another one, but let's stop there.
He didn't, he didn't talk about politics all that much. But the things I remember about Kennedy is when Bobby, used to dress in corduroys and T-shirts and dungarees and stuff like that. And then Benko influenced him. He said, you're a grandmaster. You should dress nicely. And Benko was very much into good clothing and good dressing. And he took Bobby up to Little Hungary, which is a section in Manhattan, and there was a tailor there, and tailor started making him some bespoke clothing, and Bobby dressed after a while like a fashion plate. People wouldn't recognize him. He would have his hair combed, parted nicely and stuff. Any event, we were talking about Kennedy or something, and he said, I don't like the way he dresses. He has his hands in his pockets. That's no way to dress for the president of the United States. I mean, it was so childish in some ways, critical. He also asked me, he said, do you think Kennedy plays chess? And I said, I don't know, but I'll find out. And I wrote Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary, and does the president play chess? And I got a letter back. I think I still have a copy of it, saying, no, I never saw him play chess, Pierre Salinger said, but he does play a mean game of checkers. And I disappointed him. So I don't think that Bobby was particularly grieving or mournful when Kennedy was assassinated. I mean, he just went on his life.
Okay, yeah. Okay, and then the second part of Brian Karen's question says, in 1968, Fischer went to Titania and lamented his past and his quotes past anti-Semitism, calling it stupid. 1968 also coincided with a great leap in his strength. Did his peak strength coincide with peak sanity?
Well, I don't think Bobby was insane. So that's I take issue with that question in terms of saying sanity. I don't think he was insane, but I also think that his peak really came after Stockholm, and then after playing Petrosian and Taimanov and Larson. and winning almost every single game, and then winning the World Championship. I think that was his peak strength. So that was a little later than that. I'm not familiar with his quote about thinking that what he was saying about anti-Semitism was stupid. I'm glad that he did say it, but I'm not familiar with that.
Right.
But he did, he said things like at one point, when was it? Probably around 1964, I think he said to me, it was almost as a non sequitur. He said, "I wish this whole stuff was over." I said, "What whole stuff?" "The whole complicated stuff." He said, "With the Russians, it's the controversy and it's complicated, and I just wish I hadn't ever brought it up." So he could see that he had done wrong in certain things. So I'm glad that he said he regretted about his anti-Semitic remarks.
Okay. Yeah. Obviously, those, if they did change, they changed back, unfortunately. So
yes, they did. Unfortunately, by all means, they got worse.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I believe, I think it was also in the Fred Wilson interview that not just that you don't think Bobby was insane, but you don't really think he suffered from mental illness. Is that still your feeling?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, that makes it in effect worse when you look at his political views and some of his other views. I mean, he seemed to have a mean streak in him, and I don't share his political views in any way, shape, or form. So, but I don't think he was insane or really anywhere near it. Unfortunately, the publisher of my book, Endgame, said on the cover, and I said, "You can't do that," and I had no control over it. So, and they said, and I'm going to read it, Bobby Fischer's remarkable rise and fall from America's brightest prodigy to the edge of madness. I don't think he actually was to the edge of madness. He was to the edge of perhaps gross neurosis.
Okay, interesting. And what about, obviously, in researching Endgame, you went to Iceland and spoke to many of his friends and acquaintances from his late years. What kind of impression did they have of his late years?
Well, they were much more positive than most people about him because, they were the ones who went to Japan and got him out of prison. So, Magnus Skulason, who was a psychiatrist, he was the head of an insane asylum. He was not Bobby's psychoanalyst or anything, but he became a friend of Bobby's, and he was with him at the time of death, just before it. He said he thought Bobby was misunderstood. He was a complicated character, and he was not a bad person. He was saying that Bobby must have mellowed. He didn't know Bobby as a youngster. But almost all the Icelanders, of course, they were happy that he became an Icelandic citizen, and they were proud of that fact, and so they didn't look down on him in any way.
Okay. And one more Fischer question. This one is from Douglas Griffin, who I don't know if you've come across it, Frank, but he has a great historical chess blog with lots of Soviet era pictures, and he does translating from Russian. I don't believe that you're on Twitter, Frank, but he's pretty active on chess Twitter. So I think you would enjoy his site. So Doug asks, what's that?
I would like to look into it.
Okay, I'll send it to you. So Doug asks, he says, Fischer's games were among the first master games I ever became familiar with. And later, when I saw Boleslavsky's games, I was struck with how many of the latter's favorite opening lines were also favorites of Fischer's. For example, the King's Indian with black, the Roy Lopez, the Sozin against the Sicilian, two knights against the Caro Khan, etc. As a youngster, Fischer seemed to have followed Soviet chess quite closely, but did he ever mention Boleslavsky as a particular influence?
No, he never mentioned Boleslavsky to me. Occasionally, he mentioned players, like he mentioned Spassky, he mentioned Tal, I once asked him about Donner for some reason, and he said Donner is the weakest grandmaster in the world. I don't know how, he's not even a master. I mean, he said, well, that's untrue. I mean, he was a grandmaster. But nevertheless, I could see why Bobby would be influenced by Boleslavsky, who was a great opening theoretician. And he came out with a book in Russian, his selected games in 1957. So, and Bobby was influenced by the Russians. He was going to he's living practically into the Four Continents bookstore on Fifth Avenue and 22nd Street, wherever it was. He'd go there every day that had Russian language books and publications, and he would read we could read Russian. So I can't be sure. I didn't see it in his library, but I'm sure he had Boleslavsky's book, and of course he would have seen Boleslavsky's games. So my answer is that he probably was influenced, but he never mentioned.
Okay, interesting. And you mentioned Spassky, and I know in Endgame you have a few quotes from him. It sounds like in addition to, of course, Spassy and Fischer having very friendly relations through their lives, you got some good input from Spassky. Do you still ever hear from him?
No. I wrote to him. Of course, I saw him and met him, and he was courteous, unlike the other Russians, I might add. He was courteous to me. He was a gentleman. He was like a Russian prince. He really was. He really had manners. It's like he came from royalty somehow. Very, very nice, well-spoken man. So I talked to him in Reykjavik. That was the first time I had ever met him. But then when I was researching the book, I wrote to him, and he answered a couple of letters, and that's where I got information that I put into the book. When Bobby died, he was quoted as saying, he sent Einar, or actually it's Einar Einarsson in Reykjavik, my brother has died. I mean, he really had affection for Bobby, even though he lost the championship to Bobby. And then, of course, he had played the rematch in 1992. But I don't know what else do you want to know about Spassky and Fischer? Or once he said when Fischer was in prison, he said they should put me in prison with a chess set. It's just me and Bobby.
Oh, that's so nice.
Something like I'd rather have a woman.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, and I remember in Endgame you say in the 92 match when at some point it looked like Spassky had an opportunity to sort of put some pressure on Bobby in terms of his prospects for winning the match. You felt like maybe Spassky didn't even really, like he had mixed feelings about the idea of his winning the match because he wanted to bring Fischer back into the chess world.
Well, yes, and that brings up something else, which is, again, this is rumor. About a year and a half before the 92 match, I ran into a lawyer who lived in the Upper West Side here in Manhattan, who I knew by the name of Darnay Hoffman, controversial man, but a lawyer. And he had been trying, I think he was working with the Geraldo Rivera show to try to get an interview with Bobby. And he said, have you heard there's going to be a Fischer-Spassky match? So I said, what are you talking about? Fischer hasn't played in almost 20 years. He said, no. He said, there's going to be a Fischer-Spassky match. I said, how do you know that? I can't tell you the source, he said. And I said, so how's it coming about? He said, Spassky has agreed to throw the match so that Bobby would win. And Spassky's getting a tremendous amount of money to do it. I said, I absolutely do not believe that. I think it's untrue. Spassky was not the kind of person who would do that. No, he had too much pride for his own reputation. I shouldn't throw out rumors like that because who knows? But on the other hand, when Spassky did say that to me in the letter, that he had misgivings, it dragged back to the conversation I had with Darnay Hoffman a year and a half before that.
Yeah, that's interesting. But it seems like who would think that he needed to throw the match in advance? I mean,
yeah.
Because I remember before Fischer came back, people I mean, obviously his games were of a decent quality in the return match against Spassky, but nowhere near his peak. But before then, sort of when chess players sort of gossiped and speculated, as they love to do, people felt like if he came back, he would still be, world class.
Yes.
So it'd be weird to arrange him throwing it in advance.
Exactly. And of course, Fischer was not the old Fischer.
Right.
But he still played a pretty good game.
Yeah, not so bad. So I could talk about Fischer forever, Frank, but there's so many other topics. So let's hop into the one last question from Brian Karen, which is, he says to ask you to share your favorite non-Fischer chess-related story or stories, if any, jump to mind.
That's a hard question to answer because there have been so many stories. My life has been so wrapped around chess. But one I like is that Marcel Duchamp, one of the world's most controversial, in many ways, artists and most famous artists, was a great and loyal member of the Marshall Chess Club. He belonged at the very, very beginning until his death. And he loved the Marshall so much that he moved across the street, right, literally across the street.
Wow.
And he invited me over to dinner to his house one night. And his wife, Teeny, who was the daughter-in-law of Renoir, married to Renoir's son and then married Duchamp later on, made the dinner, but she didn't eat with us for some reason. Just the two of us had the quick dinner, and then he said, "Okay, how about a game?" And I said, "Okay." And he was a very humble, nice guy, and we got to an end game, and where he was better, but if I could seize the opposition, there would be nothing he could do. It would have to be a draw. There would be no way he could promote. And he said, "Oh," in his slight French accent, "Oh, the opposition." And I said, "Yeah, you understand it?" I said, What is there to understand? He said, "Oh, no, it's very complicated." He said, "I wrote a book about it." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, would you like a copy?" I said, "Okay." And right there in his living room, there was a closet. He opened the closet, and from floor to ceiling and from wall to wall, must have been 1,000 copies of the book that he wrote on the opposition of the Sister Squares. And he autographed it for me. And somewhere in the jumble of my house or in my storage rooms, I still have that book somewhere.
That's amazing.
A collector's item. But, I like that because I wasn't even familiar with the book.
Is it well known that he wrote this book?
Yeah, it's pretty well known.
Okay.
But I don't know if you can get one in English. I really don't. This was in French.
Huh. Wow, that's amazing. And yeah, you describe in your book, I mean, often when you were walking around with Fischer, it was in the East or the West Village. And of course, this was kind of a very bohemian time. I just can't imagine sort of the intersection of the artists and the intellectuals and the chess players and the vagabonds that you must have experienced in those days.
Oh, it was incredible. And Duchamp said something that I always liked. He said, all chess players are artists. Not all artists are chess players, but all chess players are artists. And it's an interesting philosophy. That's how that's how Duchamp looked upon the game. And that's how I've always tried to look at the game when I enter the Marshall. To me, I'm entering, a place where artists perform.
That's cool to hear. And I saw that you played in Parsippany this year. You played a couple games. Is that right?
I played 2 games in Parsippany. It's been a while. I lost the first. And then something clicked in me in the second, like, oh, that's what chess is all about. And I managed to win the second game. So I was standing in for someone who couldn't play on the Sabbath. And so I played his 2 games. And I was looking forward to going back in February, but apparently it's not going to be held.
Okay, yeah. Well, hopefully next year. I'd love to meet you in person if that happens.
I'd love to also meet you.
Just looking at you and hearing you talk about that, the fact that you're 86 and you're vibrant and have such a great memory of all these historic encounters you had. Do you have any?
Better, believe me. I wish it was better.
Well, don't we all? But do you have any health advice, mental health, physical health for our listeners?
Well, I don't smoke. I don't drink. I don't exercise. I do drink coffee. I don't take drugs. And nor does my wife, all of these things. I did smoke at one point. My wife's never smoked and she never drank coffee, so she's 2 ahead of me. But we've been married for 57 years, and she gets up every morning and walks a couple of miles a day, and really keeps. And she's not quite as old as me, but she's in much better shape than even I am. So that's my secret.
Okay.
Don't smoke, don't drink, don't gamble, live a good life.
You're ruining all the fun, though, Frank. So, of course, you're a media professor, and you've written a book about Orson Welles. Obviously, you've written many books, not just related to chess. So, I've got to ask you about the hot topic of the chess world. I don't know if you've watched Queen's Gambit or not, Frank, but everyone is discussing it. So, I feel compelled.
Oh, yes. I watched all of it, and I had read the book when it came out in 1983. And by the way, if I'm allowed to plug this, I don't know, but the Marshal on November 21st is going to have a Zoom discussion, and I'm going to be the host and leader of it because one of my master's degrees that I have is in film, so the connection of film and chess. So we're going to have that on November 21st at 7 p.m. But I thought the film was almost identical to the book. The film was a little more exciting than the book. When I read the book, I remember the first time, and even this time, I reread it recently. I felt, how does someone who doesn't play the game, how do they get through some of these games by just a description? And that doesn't seem to bother. I've gotten emails from, and the same thing might apply to the film series. I've gotten emails now from relatives and friends on how much they like it, and some of them don't know a pawn from a rook. And so I'm excited that New York Times did 3 full-page stories, different stories on it. Howard Stern mentioned it on his show last week. All kinds of things are happening. As there was just like a little boomlet.
Yeah,
like the Fischer boom.
Well, yeah. Could you compare them?
Fischer boom was incredible. Within a week after the match was over, or even during the week, Bloomingdale's and Macy's sold out all of their chess sets. Everybody was playing chess. People were calling the Marshall Chess Club and saying, how can I get lessons? The Marshall Chess Club went up. We had something like 300 members at the time. It went up to, according to the New York Times, I can't even believe this, but they say that went up to 800 members. I don't know where we would put everybody, but everything was boom. Everybody was playing chess. You could see it being played on the stoops of New York and all over. People were tuning in on television. And some people, Jay Bonin, International Master, said he became interested in the game by watching it on television. And that's what got him going. And a number of other people as well.
Yeah, Patrick Wolf, I know, was touched by that match. Of course, John Donaldson, the aforementioned. I know there's so many that wouldn't have spent their careers in chess were it not for that match. So, but it's interesting to hear that what's going on is incredible and it's fun to see. But there's, attention is just so diffuse now. Like there's just so many things that people can be interested in that it would be hard to replicate the Fischer boom.
Well, it's a perfect thing for the quarantine age now, the pandemic age. You're home. What can we do tonight? Oh, well, we have this chess set in the back of the room. And look, this is what, I could see people getting influenced. And they are.
Yeah. And another thing that you mentioned in your archived interviews with Fred Wilson is that you'd had a couple movie deals with for your books. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because even was this about the Fischer books? Do you mind saying? Or
well, I got an offer for an option, and I received some money for Profile of a Prodigy. We've gotten no offers for the film of Endgame, but I've gotten offers from some of my other books during the years. Options. People take options.
Were these other, sorry to cut you off, were these other chess books or?
No.
Okay.
No. So any event, I have an agent, and my agent is pushing now to see whether or not we can get a film, at least an option on Endgame.
It's tough though. His late years were so sad.
My book is it's been translated into 12 languages. The paperback and the Kindle is still selling, and it's now selling even more. I think what else could be? It has to be from the film, Netflix film. Right now, it's selling more.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was wondering, like, how much you could say about that, because book sales figures are often shrouded in mystery to those of us who are not chess authors. I mean, we know that if you write like an opening book, I mean, if you sell, say, 10,000 copies, you did amazing. But I know you made a conscious effort in Endgame to not dramatize the game so much and not include game scores. You wanted it to be readable for just people with a passing interest in chess, but who wanted to hear the human side of Fischer. So a book like that, like what sort of scale do the sales come down on?
Well, we've sold well over 30,000 copies. I mean, I don't know how many we sold right before when it came out, but it did make the bestseller list a loss for not very long, but it did enter the bestseller list. So I'm very happy with it and surprised that it sold the way it did. And the amount of reviews I've gotten, hundreds of reviews and many interviews and stuff like that. So I'm happy.
Happy. Well, your success is well deserved. I mean, I just read it for a second time getting ready for the interview, and it's still a page turner, even knowing the story and reading it a second time.
Well, I teach and have taught writing for many, many years. And, I spent some time at Harvard I never matriculated or anything, but I spent some time studying the Nemenyi fellowship principles in some ways of creative nonfiction. And that's how I like to think of my book. It's creative nonfiction. It's I use some of the same techniques as a novelist, but without making anything up. The use of dialogue, the use of inner states. Well, how do I know how a person was feeling? I ask them.
Right.
And they tell me, that kind of thing. And and a great amount of that book, as far as I was concerned, were like little scenes that you could see in a film almost. So any event, that was my technique. I threw my heart and soul in it. I threw in everything I knew about Fischer, except the rumors that I just told you.
Any other rumors we should know about?
None that I would like to repeat. But,
okay.
It's strange to say, although I despise what Fischer has said about Judaism and about America, I really do. But I still miss him somehow.
Wow. Yeah.
As a person, I miss him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just as a chess fan, obviously not having known him, I even have a tinge of guilt just being so fascinated because there's so many. I mean, you've written about sort of separating the art from the artist, but there's so many people who are admirable, like unequivocally admirable, and that's not the case with Fischer. Yet there's still this insatiable appetite to know more about him.
Yeah, it's one of my faculty members, who was one of my committee members on my dissertation, once said to me, and he wrote many biographies of people and stuff. He said, when you get somebody, like a Herman Melville or a Shelley or a Bobby Fischer or whatever, there's always going to be new things coming out about them and new perceptions. And I wouldn't be surprised that I haven't checked the national dissertation list, but I wouldn't be surprised that I do know of one dissertation that was written about it. people are still studying his life.
Yeah, I know. I'm looking forward, and I know you mentioned via email you're also looking forward to I Am John Donaldson's new book.
I'm looking forward to John's. I really respect John. I think he's a terrific guy, and a relentless researcher.
That's for sure. Yeah,
he went everywhere and did everything and looked at everything, and he went to every place that Bobby went. His book is going to be good. I can't wait for it to come out. I ordered it way back in September.
Excellent. And what are your favorite books aside from that, whether chess or narrative nonfiction, as you mentioned?
Well, right now I'm reading almost too much about the Trump. Oh
my goodness! Yeah, let's not go there.
I can't stop reading them. I mean, Bob Woodward comes out or whatever. A book about Melania, a book, so I'm spending a great deal of time reading that. And I like to read history books. I like to read books on the Civil War and go into it. And there's so many books and so little time.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite chess book?
Favorite chess book? That's another hard one. Maybe I would say my 60 Memorable Games.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that, which I was also going to ask you if you have a favorite Fischer book other than your own, but I guess that might check both of those boxes.
Well, I have some Fischer books that I hate, like Brad Dara's book. But I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. And Frank, is there any, I also wanted to ask you, I don't have too many more questions. I really appreciate your you're taking so much time. Is there anyone in your opinion that I should interview? Someone of your generation that has like tons of stories from the days of chess history?
I would say you might consider Asa Hoffman.
Yes, I know Asa. Yeah.
He's got a million stories, and he goes way back with Fischer, and goes way back with chess. He's getting up there in age. So that's the one right off the top of my head. Gary Foreman, I don't know if you know Gary. He's a master player. He's a member of the Marshall. He also has a good memory. Goes way back. You might, are you interested in interviewing somebody, who are into chess books, for instance?
Oh yeah.
Andy Ansell, I don't know who he is.
Yeah, one of the biggest chess book collections in the world, right?
Yep. David Delucia, Jeffrey Tannenbaum. They all have enormous collections. I think Gary Foreman also has an enormous collection. I mean, it's an interesting, I'm calling these guys all the time when I, looking for a particular fact, and they'll have the book or they'll know it.
Right.
They really know their stuff about chess.
Amazing. So before I let you go, Frank, bringing it back to Queen's Gambit, again, so you said it was November 21st, 7 p.m. So I encourage, if there's no capacity for a number of people that can attend.
I don't know. I have to talk to the executive director of the club and see how it's going to work.
Okay.
What do they do with big Zoom crowds? Do they limit it to a certain number? I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can have more than 100, but I don't know. I don't know how.
I doubt we'll get more than 100, but we may, because the announcement went out to the entire club, and we have almost 400 members. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, thousands of people will be hearing about this too, hearing from this. So yeah, so So maybe we'll try to, before this comes out, I'll try to get I'll coordinate with you and find out if people like from the general public can watch.
I'll be happy to tell you.
So I'll put it. Okay. So for listeners, I'll put that in the show notes. So last thing, where would you rank Queen's Gambit as compared to other sort of film representations of chess?
Way up there, you know, in the top. I wouldn't say it's the best of all, but I would say it's way up there. You know, there were other films. Another film just came out, by the way, called Critical Thinking.
Yeah, that's right.
But that seemed to be a little redundant in that there are a lot of stories about somebody going to inner city schools and teaching kids and they become champions. Not that that's bad.
Right.
It wasn't badly done, but you know, I'm trying to think.
So what do you think is the best? You mentioned that it's not the best.
I'm trying to think. There was a film called, it was based on Stefan Zweig's book or novella called The Royal Game by Stefan Zweig. But that's not the name of the film, and it's in German.
Okay.
But it's absolutely excellent.
Okay. Well,
hard to get even on DVD. I don't know if one can get it. I put that way up there. There was also a film, I'm forgetting names, forgetting everything, that John Turturro played in as a grandmaster who goes berserk.
Was that the Illusion Defense? Was that the Nabokov one?
Yes, based on the Nabokov.
Yeah, okay.
The Illusion Defense, thank you for that title. See, when you're younger, you can remember those things.
Well, it's like playing chess. You know, we've been going for 90 minutes. You can still play really well, but it's just hard to last as long, I think. I mean, I feel that at 43. So,
yeah, the Illusion Defense was excellent. But you know, a lot of films been made that shows how crazy, you know, chess players could become, whereas and Chess Life, of course, I mean, not Chess Life, The Queen's Gambit. My only problem with the story, and I don't want to, it would be a spoiler to say this, so I'm not going to say it.
Okay, well, I'll tell you one critique I happened upon today, and this will be just a closing note. Grandmaster Peter Hein Nielsen, Magnus Carlsen's chief second, who's also been on the podcast, was just mentioning that it was excellent storytelling, but he felt that, and apologies for listeners who haven't seen it. Listeners, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely watch it. He felt that her ascent didn't have enough struggle. It didn't show that when you're a chess player, I mean, with the possible exception of Bobby Fischer, no one, like everyone has slumps. Everyone has to grind super hard. Whereas for her, it was just kind of straight to the top.
It's an excellent perception. It's an excellent observation. I hadn't thought of it.
Yeah, I hadn't either.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's a good
yeah. Okay, well, Frank, I had great expectations and this exceeded it. This has been amazing. It's so incredible to hear your firsthand perspective of so much chess history. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's been an honor for me to be here.
Special thanks, as always, to my producer, Matthew Passy, and thanks to those who help continue to spread the word about perpetual chess, whether it's via a positive review on a podcast platform, or telling a friend, or however you choose to do it. You can also engage with the perpetual chess community. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at BennyFisher1, or join the perpetual Facebook group and continue the conversation about the latest interview. For now, the Perpetual Chess Instagram page has gone back into retirement, but someday we will break the blockade and start marching up the board again. Last but not least, you can also email me through the podcast website or directly at ben@perpetualchesspod.com. But more than anything, I would like to express my gratitude to those who provide financial support to Perpetual Chess. Most of all, I want to thank Chessable for sponsoring the show, and to everyone who kicks in via PayPal or the Perpetual Chess Patreon page to support this community endeavor and allow me to sustain and continue to improve the show. So without further ado, I would like to give special thanks to the following people and entities. They are Chessable.com, Quality Chess Books, The Capital City Chess Club, the Abysmal Depths of Chess blog, Adapta Interactive Web Designs and Services, Apprend Chess Twitch channel, Andrew Alharji, Andrew Bach, Andy Ryerson, Aniti Deer, Austin Clough, Benjamin Porteau, Bill Sigler, Kathy Carr, Chad Oliver, the Charlotte Chess Center, the Chess Central's Chess blog, chessmood.com, Chris Flanagan, Dan O'Hanlon, Daniel He, Danny Davidson, David Schreiber, Derek Jones, I am Dimitri Schneider, Drake Domingue, I am Eric Rosen, Eric Tam, Ewan Richardson, Faraz Sawaf, Gary Foreman, Glenn Downing, Greg Harfst, I am Greg Shahadi, Gregory Galuk, Guven Manet, James Kennedy, Jen Scream, Jeremy Nielsen, John Jernigan, John Rockefeller, John Cromartie, John MacArthur, Kelly Palmer, Kevin O'Callahan, King Selt, Lucio Casada Silva, the law offices of Stuart Katz, LeelaAnalysis.com for cloud-based Leela engine analysis, Michael Can, FM Michael Oblin, Mike Zalazny, Mr. Mike Shahadi, the famous Mr. Dodgy, the Nerdinays Twitch channel, Peter Sodi, Play More Chess Academy of the Hamden Chess Club, Reuven Fisher, Robert Karcher, the Seattle Chess Club, Shane Unger, Stephen Kelty, Stephen Martinez, Thomas Stanix, Thomas Tachenko, Todd Bryant of StrongChess.com, Todd Kennedy, the Vintage Patzers, which is a Chess.com improver group, Wayne Beam, William Hogarth, and I would also like to thank Aaron Waffler, Ace Vallega, Adam Ralph of ChessEngland.com, Adrian Gutierrez, Alex Pejas, FM Andre Terakov, Dr. Andrew Perry, Barry Hessian, Bill Juniper, Bill Moran, Brad and Andy Rosen, Brett Howard Lynn, Brian Mullis, Brian Tillis, Bruce Scott, Chad Hilton, Dr. Charles Snodgrass, Chris Wainscott, Christopher Baumgartner, Christopher Chabris, Chris Lott, Christopher Wood, I am Christoph Zalecki, aka Chess Explained, Coach J's Chess Academy, Costa Carras, Courtney Fry, Craig Mallon, Daniel Ginsberg, Daniel Naylor, Dave Saylor, David Bleskacek, David Hamblin, David Cramerly of Chessable, David Lazaris of LazmanChess.com, Dalen Shelton, Dennis Parrish, Dirk Decker, FM Donny Ariel, not I Am Elect, Drake Domingue, Dwayne Edmonds, Ed Daly, Ethan Smith, Hallelujah Cat, Ian Mason, Indrik Ryland, Fide Arbeiter, Felipe Melo Pereira, Fox Valley Chess Club, Francis Letarte Lavoie, Dr. Frank Tortoris, Frank Zananis, Gary Andrews, Gary Lewis, Geert Vanderveld, Gene Stewart, Gerard Barta, Giovanni Russo, Hans Schut, Harash Srinivasan, Jacob Kovac, Jacob Turan, Jacques Pari, James Aspinwall, James Benastia, James Moore, Jason Woolham, J. Deep Chakrabarty, Jeff Anderson, Jeffrey Martello, Yep Hoyland, Jerry Wells, Jim Ratliff, J.J. Stranad, Juan Almagor, Dr. John Fallon, John Fernandez, John Fontaine, John Hartman, John Jeffrey, John McMurtry, Jonathan Slater, Jose Rodriguez, Justin Gardner, Jen Shahadi, Joel Rocky, John Thompson, GM Josh Friedel, I am Kare Christensen, WGM Katerina Nemtsova, Kelly Palmer, Kevin Pryor, Kior Gata of the Lakeshore Chess Club, I am Kostya Kovutsky, Krishna Gopala Krishnan, Kyle McAvoy, Larry Ryforth, Laura Boyovsky, Macaulay Peterson, Martin Knudsen, Martin Krug, Matthew Passy, Matthew Tedesco, the Mechanics Institute Chess Club of San Francisco, Michael Allard, Michael Hudson, Miguel Aristide, Mike Clem, Mitchell Fabian, Nate Solon, Neil Bruce, Negmat Mulajanov, Nicholas Isabel, Olaf Mueller-Michaels, GM Pascal Charbonneau, Passy Passanen, Paul Bain, Paul Clarkson, Paul Sweeney, Paulo Santana, Peter Lux, Randy Temple, Ricky Grijalva, Richard Hollenbach, Robert Tichy, Robert Turner, Roy Yearwood, Ryan Berg, the Say Chess YouTube channel, Scott Doherty, Scott McKinnon, Sebastian Finsterwater, Shane Unger, Stefan Roller, Sven Retjik, WGM Tatya Abrahamian, Tim Brennan of TacticsTime.com, Tim Seymour, Timothy Ha, Tom Edsel, Tomas Komanich, Tony Rotella, Tyron Price, Vishnu Srikumar, William Brock, William Juniper, William Peterson, FM Zhao Cheng of Chess1000.com, and Zhivko Story Yanov. Thanks for listening, everyone. I will catch you guys next week.